Okay, so this is a YouTube that's going to just go through about 15 or 20 slides that hopefully sets the stage for the second half of the quarter as we scale up from species level conservation to systems level conservation. And most of the time we're going to be thinking about what are the conservation science questions that dominate our field. But I'd like you to be thinking about other fields and how they relate to conservation in the background while we're talking about this. And so here's where we start. So Brooks et al. Is the fundamental reading for this lecture. And if you look at these 9 different hotspot maps, particularly if you look at the one in the upper left and the one down the lower right, that are looking at different values for conservation. The one on the lower right is last of the wild, and the one on the upper left is crisis ecoregions. That those really represent two ends of a conceptual extreme of where humans are living and where humans are not living. And you get the impression that virtually all of the world is covered by one of these hotspot maps. And so it provides they all in aggregate provide arguments for why you could be working in one place or another place. But it often doesn't say how you should work in those areas. And I'd like to for us to think about that as we move through the quarter, and particularly on Monday. So here's what I'm gonna how I'm gonna frame this idea of international conservation, and I'll go through some of these things in a little bit more detail. But I want to get some background stuff out of the way, and that we have several predominant models for international conservation, and several new ones are emerging. So there's kind of old-fashioned ones of throwing money at it, and so this integrated conservation development programs where the United Nations, USAID, pay people to provide economic development and also try and develop conservation programs. So man in the biosphere reserves are a classic case of this kind of a program. And that there's now iterations of this, the enlightened ICDP, that putting people on aid doesn't help them in the long run, that you have to provide for self-governance and ways for people to become self-reliant, and that community-based conservation is an outgrowth of this. Another model is throwing laws at it. So we have the United Nations Environment Program and a slug of international treaties. Things like CITES, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, the Convention on Biological Diversity. There's a bunch of ones in the ocean as well, including the International Whaling Commission and other fisheries agreements. And we'll talk a bit about those. In fact, I'm going to give the bulk of this little YouTube is going to be background on CITES and Convention on Biological Diversity, so we don't have to spend too much time talking about it on Monday. But then there are these many new conservation models, and so there's a debate going on, particularly between Michael Soule and Peter Kariva and Michel Marvier on new conservation. But the idea here is that there's a whole bunch of new ideas to think about these former ideas a little bit differently. Payments for ecosystem services, make conservation pay, land sparing versus land sharing, or bioeconomic models of efficiency, the Lynn Ostrom model and governing the commons, sort of getting around the barriers associated with the tragedy of the commons models. And there's a whole new organization called Science for Nature and People, which is what NCEAS in Santa Barbara is morphing into through support from some big donors, the Nature Conservancy and other organizations. And this is all sort of brought to light in that the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Engineering, just in the last, I don't know how recently, but very recently, released this book called Facilitating Interdisciplinary Research. And it brought it to mind because a reporter from Bioscience was talking to me yesterday, in part because in Bioscience we had published this paper about a year and a half ago on managed relocation, where we had a team of about 35 authors, and it was one of these big interdisciplinary teams. But there's recommendations in there, and one of them is for graduate studies, graduate students should explore ways to broaden their experience by gaining requisite knowledge in one or more fields in addition to their primary field. So in other words, that you shouldn't just have depth in one area, but you should have some breadth as well. And so we're going to be thinking about this as we move through, because I think conservation is one of those areas where there's really kind of a burgeoning interdisciplinarity of how conservation is going on and being practiced around particularly around the world. that we still hearken to the best available science and a lot of science-based management in managing resources in this country, but it seems much more driven by sociological processes in many other parts of the world. Okay, so a little background on some international treaties and conventions. There's been some major ones. A lot of them were started in the 70s and 80s. In brief, those that started in the 70s and 80s, the U.S. generally signed on to. The ones that we've started later, the U.S. has generally has not signed on to. So the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species is from 1973. The Convention on Biological Diversity, 1992, and we are not a signatory nation of the CBD, nor are we of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In other words, we have had our administrations have friendly feelings towards these organizations, but to become a signatory nation, the Congress has to pass some resolutions, and they have failed to do that consistently. Okay, so what is CITES? It's the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna in Florida, and it tries to help countries negotiate on concerns about trading in wildlife and foster enforcement. Now, frankly, they're very small organizations. There's the United Nations Environment Program with a small CITES secretariat, and that they hold these conferences of the parties where they set trade regulations on species, but that and there's animals and plant committees that make recommendations to that conference of the parties, but those are all staffed by volunteers from different countries, and so it's actually a tiny number of people who are actually working for CITES as a program. As a consequence, it's only making the rules. It's organizations like Traffic and another an international NGO that's working to help on other countries that on enforcement. So how does CITES operates? Every 3 years, there's a conference of the parties. Committees may routinely meet to make recommendations, and modifications by committees become recommendations to be taken up at the next COP meeting. And that a lot of the action, most of the species on the list are in Appendix 2, and this is where there is a legal trade of species, and that Appendix 2 operates largely on export permits. So in other words, countries gain legal access to taking organisms out of a country. And that works in theory better than import restrictions where you're trying to catch things at the border. There's a global database with these 3 appendices. Appendix 1 is a no-trade list. Appendix 2 has these quotas, as I mentioned. Appendix 3, also a small list of species. This is where countries, mostly on single country endemics, are looking for assistance from the international community on helping them protect their species. And a lot of what CITES does is keep a global database on these different species and manage that trade. Why is it of interest to the United States? Well, a lot of the developed countries are where that trade happens. So here's a scientific report on the trade in this Southeast Asian bullfrog that's coming out of India and China. And you can see by these arrows on the right where the destination for most of that traffic is, and it's moving into either the United States or Europe for culinary purposes of eating frog legs. Very cute bullfrog, isn't it? And this then becomes a portion of the scientific literature that every year there are several papers that are put out reporting on the degree to which CITES is managing to regulate trade in different organisms. And here's an example of this. You can pause it if you want and take a look at some of these papers, but these are just ones that pop up in 2014, so they're happening all the time. And of course, there are some big issues on CITES that get a lot of attention in the press. That elephants, for example, are endangered in some countries and are nuisance species in others, and so trade in ivory has been a very difficult thing. And as a consequence, it's on Appendix 1, the no-trade list, in many countries, except for populations in Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, where they have local overabundance problems and they're nuisance species to farmers and crops. And in which case there is some trade because these countries are having to cull elephant herds to maintain populations at regular sizes. But nowhere has this really hit the big time in terms of public awareness is in the plight of the rhinos. And there's 5 rhinos around the world. These are some numbers, but the white rhino was very, very near extinction. The South African government engaged in a captive breeding program, been very successful. It's now the most common rhino in the world, and it is on Appendix 2, and national parks in South Africa were trading rhinos within the country, basically selling excess rhinos from national parks into game reserves for hunting and things like this. But poaching has become a major problem, and so here's the number of rhinos poached per year over the last several years. It's out of control, and as a consequence, there are now scientists. This is Dwan Biggs and then in Hugh Poslingham's lab at the University of Queensland, writing in Science, a policy forum, calling for the removal of the white rhino from the Appendix 2 of the CITES list and put it onto an economic market of trade, and feeling like that this would be a better way to do conservation of the rhino and so the message here is conservation needs better economic models. I'm going to try and rip through this pretty quickly. The other one that I want to talk about was the Convention on Biological Diversity. It has 3 big issues: protecting the Earth's biodiversity, but it also has a focus on sustainable use of critical natural resources and equitable sharing of benefits. So there are many cases where, for example, rubber was illegally exported from Brazil. Plantations were developed in Indonesia. Brazil lost a huge amount of money when the rubber trade went to Southeast Asia instead of being in Brazil. And so there's now protocols on access and benefit sharing to help countries protect their rights with respect to biological diversity that has economic value. But there's also, and this Cartagena Protocol on biosafety is about movement of genetically modified organisms across international borders, trying to maintain some control on that. But these 2020 Aichi targets are this idea that the Convention on Biological Diversity is trying to foster the protection of biological diversity internationally. You can take a pause here and look at this, but that this dates back to the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, which really framed the UN's position on the environment, and the 1992 Earth Summit, out of which the convention was developed. How does it work? It mostly works on national reports, self-reporting on progress towards these goals, and having action plans. It's got the same kind of secretariat structure as the CITES does. How are things going? Not so well. But in this set of goals, the CBD has adopted an explicitly anthropocentric approach to ecosystem-based management. The box on the right are 12 principles of the ecosystem approach that the CBD has adopted. 1 through 4 and 10 through 12 are all about people, and then 5 through 9 in the middle is about ecology. So it's really about conservation and people, conservation for people, not conservation from people. We failed generally to meet the 2010 targets of the Convention on Biological Diversity, so there are 2020 targets. And that there are 20 total targets linked to 5 different general strategies. You can take a look at those here. I'll go over these a little bit more on Monday. Many of them are aspirational and are trying to mainstream biodiversity and make it, build it into economic models of how people behave. And the NGOs are all engaging on this. Nature Conservancy and World Wildlife Fund are thinking about the Convention on Biological Diversity and how do they help countries get there. There, of course, is some ecology in there that the targets suggest that we should be maintaining 17% of terrestrial ecosystems around the world and 10% of coastal and marine areas. And that's where countries aren't doing as well as they could in terms of getting there. So skipping down here, the rest of the quarter is going to look like this, that we have reserve design, communities to ecosystems to coupled human natural systems, a bit about adaptive management, and then thinking about incentives for conservation and community-based solutions. But a lot of this is going to be about the science of conservation and what we do as ecologists and how that relates to this larger system work. But in the background, always we should be thinking about how this gets done within a socio-ecological context, and the degree to which economists and social scientists and behavioral biologists really have some important things to say about how taking that best available ecological sciences and making it workable for people. Okay, see you Monday.